So if you haven't heard of BenchSci before, and we're a pretty small company, so under 100 employees, so you probably haven't. And what we do is we do what's called AI-assisted reagent selection. And what that means in practice for our customers who are drug researchers, it means they now can search over the world's publications and bioinformatics databases, as well as information from vendors, when they need to figure out what experiments to run. So let's say they have a particular protein they're interested in studying, or its expression in a cell, or some disease context, and they need a way to label it so they can see whether their experiments works. Well, there's usually different types of things you can buy, namely like an antibody that you would buy from a vendor. The problem is a lot of these experiments, even though you think they're going to work, actually won't. And certain antibodies, you might buy one and it turns out it doesn't actually work for your particular model. And so what we do is help people avoid that problem by taking information from, about 10 million science papers, our world-class bioinformatics DB, and information from vendors, and combine it together to vet and use some ML stuff to select the correct experiments. And what I'll tell you about primarily today is the document mining aspect of it. Now, obviously, there's much more to the company than that, but this is the first thing we worked on at Beam at BenchSci. So I want to give you a timeline to the story that I'm going to tell you, so you can understand, if you were considering a move to Beam or something like that, what that might actually look like at your company. So in 2015, BenchSci gets founded, and for 4 years, a lot of interesting things happen. The company finds a market, they get funding. I come on in October 2019, and they've got this document mining pipeline that they've been using for years, and it's built in Spark. And I get hired basically to be part of the team that is going to just upgrade the Spark pipeline. So that's what they were hiring for. Now, by November the same year, we started to look at other alternatives for the pipeline, and I'll get into some reasons why in a bit. And we started experimenting with Beam and then also with BigQuery as one way to do some of our heavy processing. By January, we're taking the leap of faith, switching to Beam. By March, we are experiencing a period where we're really doubting and whether this was the right choice and having some trouble. And by April, in the spring, when the flowers start to bloom, we reach a period of what I call Enlightenment, and we really feel like Beam was the right choice, and even working with its abstractions and programming model has made us better pipeliners in general. So before I get into the details of the story, I'll share with you sort of the cast, I guess, of the what's called the data run team, who are in charge of the mining pipeline at BenchSci. So down in the corner, there's me. On the hamster wheel, and then up in the top left, we've got Elvis, one of our founders and a stakeholder. And this is an important consideration when I tell you the story of how we, brought about a big change architecturally and so on, because we had one of the founders and key stakeholders on the team, so it's very easy to make decisions. And that's an important thing to know as you go into these types of work. We also had the advantage on the top right of a Google staff engineer who was doing a fellowship with the company. Because BenchSci had some funding from Google, we were able to get a lot of mentorship from Bo on the top right hand. And on bottom left, there's the tech lead of the team at the time, Jason. I'm the tech lead now, but that's another story. So this is the sort of people elements that were helpful in the success of this migration work. So what were we trying to solve? So we started with, as I said, Spark running on a Colocated cluster to do all this mining stuff. And the state of it was very labor intensive. We were using Airflow and then also just manual steps here and there to do the orchestration. And it was very difficult to do. It wasn't reproducible. We were not really able to run the pipeline from scratch. And as a science company, reproducibility is critical for us. And by from scratch, I mean loading up the papers from the archives we get from the journals. And they came to us in a lot of different ways, sometimes individual files, millions of them, sometimes archives with one single paper in it, and a bunch of images, sometimes archives with a whole issue worth of paper in it. And because of this, it made it very difficult to just load the data from the start and work with it on Spark. You had to do a lot of management, breaking things into sensible partitions and things like that. And we wanted to really run the whole thing end to end so that we could make a change anywhere, either with our archive extraction tech and see the impacts all the way down. And it was also overly opinionated. So we have a lot of embarrassingly parallel tasks, but because of the nature of the inputs, we had to write a bunch of logic and create these partition our data appropriately for Spark to run through it quickly, and it did. But the problem that would occur is that we would get this parallelization and optimization code interwoven with the business logic. So then when we needed to extend it or maintain it or something, it was very difficult to do, and the boundaries of those two things were essentially getting mixed. That wasn't good. So down at the bottom, what we kind of realized after working for a while, that we could really think of things in terms of like levels of abstraction. So kind of the simplest form of processing we could be doing is simply just queries in a data warehouse. BigQuery is a great example of you're basically just running SQL against big blob storage. Obviously, there's more to it within that under the hood, but it's a very simple abstraction for us to work with, and so on. Dataflow seems to be Beam on Dataflow seemed to be the next most simple abstraction where we wouldn't really have to worry too much about resource allocation or things like that, and so on and so on. And so we were always fully prepared to use Spark, or even if we had to, just like a Kubernetes cluster or something like that, to get what we needed to do done. But we never actually wound up having to. We've been pretty sufficient with Dataflow and BigQuery. So what we really wanted, we didn't want to just improve the pipeline. What we really wanted was to start a positive feedback loop. A big problem that the company had was they would change things in the pipeline and they wouldn't really understand whether it was actually making it better or not. They didn't have a feedback loop where they would build something, run the pipeline, measure the impacts, plan, the next step based on that measurement, and so on and so forth. So they would spend a lot of time doing a bunch of dev work, but because they would only run the pipeline once a month or once every 2 months because of how difficult it was to run, they would never really know whether the stuff they were doing was actually going in the right direction or not. And I'll give you a preview of the very end state that we wound up with. So as you can probably imagine from the talk, this was a successful migration and we're very happy with the result. Before I get into the trials and tribulations we experienced, I'll tell you right now kind of what our setup looks like. So we use Cloud Dataflow, and we actually just use the default runner, like the default worker, should I say, so very small instances. And we run our E2E tests for each PR that we put into the code base on Direct Runner that just runs on a Google Cloud build machine. Pipeline takes under 12 hours to run, which is fine, like good enough for us. We haven't put very much work or really at all work into optimizing it. It's easy to run. It just runs end to end from a single trigger that we use on Google Cloud Build. And in practice, we run this about once a week. As the team grows, we'll probably have to figure out how to run it faster. But like I said, we have not really had to put any work into optimizing it. Similarly, it's not cheap to run, but it's also not particularly expensive either. It costs about $700 to run. And considering the volume of the size of the contracts that we have with our customers, this is kind of a trivial cost. Seems a lot to me, $700 a day, but from a company perspective, it's great. I would love to tell you a bit about how much time or money we saved with the Spark pipeline, but it's difficult because we were running it on a compute, a co-located server that we owned. And we also are doing a lot of stuff in the new pipeline that we just couldn't before. And so it's kind of an apples and orange comparison. But one thing that is very different that we know is that we've got great visibility into the outputs of certain pipeline steps via both stack driver logs and data that we YValve to BQ via Beam's, BigQuery syncs. And it's been pretty great. So now let's get into the interesting parts of our story. So we switched to Beam. We decided it's the right thing to do. And then basically we've got these two data sources, bioinformatics DBs that we, are getting loaded into BigQuery. And then we've got these publication archives that are, a mixture of individual files and zip files and tarballs and such that are on GCS. And we do some document extraction, and that works. We do paper parsing to actually mine a lot of information out of there and structure the documents we're getting. That's working. And then we perform named entity recognition, where we basically look for things like the names of proteins or experimental techniques or whatever in the documents. We use the bioinformatics DBs that we have to cross-reference that. And then for the purposes of this talk, what happens afterwards is magic. It's not magic, but it's definitely out of scope for what I'm going to be talking about today. So this is all working really well. And we even add some visibility where we start y-valving the results of these operations to BigQuery. So now, for the first time, the company knows what's in its publication archives and how many papers are actually in there, like in a reliable, repeatable way. And we also can see the results of the paper parsing as well. So this is really great. But then something bad happens. We expand the coverage of the archives we're covering, and we go from, maybe under 1 million archives and individual files to, maybe 4 or 6 million, something like that, individual articles across various archives, and it stops working. The data flow job just runs and runs. The papers seem to be all getting extracted, but the throughput drops and the VMs go idle. One of our pipeline steps, the parser and write to BigQuery step, which is fused which makes sense, but that some part of that seems to be failing, and we don't really know why. And so this is a period of fear and doubt for us. We're new to the technology, and we kind of just start to flail. We start pulling stuff off the pipeline to see if we can figure out why. So we keep the expanded set of publication archives that we are working with, and we peel off the named entity recognition. Maybe it's blowing up there. Then we start blaming the BigQuery sync for whatever reason. Maybe that's not working. It still fails. It becomes fairly clear after doing this exercise that there's something going wrong in the parse paper step. And we start, getting kind of desperate. We say things like, let's just use bigger VMs. Or let's start removing parser steps and keep peeling the onion. Or the worst thing of all, this worked on Spark. So that's not something, and it did, right? So we were able to process this whole corpus. It was a real pain to do, but it was working on Spark. And so we're sort of saying, okay, what have we done to ourselves? And then, after some reflection and some coaching from our mentor, Bo, reminds us that, you're a science company, act like scientists, and actually start studying the data and artifacts that you have to understand this. So we look again, and like I said at the start, you look at the CPU utilization, and these are graphs from Dataflow. If you've never worked with Dataflow with Beam, it's pretty good, and the visualizations are. I do wish there was RAM visibility, but I think that's a difficult problem. But the graphs here kind of speak for themselves to some degree, in the sense that you can see that over the course of the job, the throughput is very fast for some processes, and that's great. And then all of a sudden, it just stops, right? It just tails off. And if you look at the individual worker usage, you can see that there's actually most activity drops, and there's like a few machines that are still essentially straggling, right? And if you take a look at the error messages here, and that was kind of part of our problem, is it was difficult for us to really pin much down, but doing some Stack Overflow searching and such, we sort of realized that it was based on this evidence. It was probably certainly due to, 1 or 2 papers, perhaps more, slowing down the system. What we didn't really understand at the time was that if a job was, if a worker process ran for more than 10 minutes, it would time out. And that's something we hadn't really understood. And that's what was going on. And so the actual root cause of this is kind of funny. We were just using, somewhere in the parsing, we were using regex to detect some punctuation. This was on Python. And, some papers have absurdly long sentences. So there's this like 168,000 character string that even on my laptop, which is, even on my laptop would take like, 10 or 12 minutes to execute. And as I mentioned, we're using very small VMs because most of the time it didn't really matter. And so these jobs would run, they would abandon themselves, go to another VM, and that would fail. And if that happens enough time, it's like 4 times, the whole pipeline fails. So we did finally figure it out by actually studying the data. And if you're wondering, during this period why we didn't, get on the mailing list or think and ask these questions, we actually figured this step out while I was writing the question for the mailing list. I was like, okay, if I'm going to actually mail the user community, I'm going to write up a proper message so they can see what I think they might need to see. And then doing the investigation just to say, okay, this is the state of things. We figured out, what was going on. So that was great. And so what we did to do that is, and kind of do as a general process in general, is anything on the input steps to your DAG in Beam, right? The edges, I guess, the northern edge or whatever you want to call it. We wrap most of that stuff in timeouts because we deal with unbounded inputs. And doing that, we discovered all sorts of other weird stuff that was coming into our pipeline. So sometimes we'd be trying to unzip an archive, but it would have gigabytes of videos from like wolf packs from an animal biology journal. Because we of course don't know without decompressing the archive whether it's going to be useful to us. Like wolf pack videos are not useful to a drug discovery company, but we don't know that, and so we have to go through everything. We could find really long character strings or just really long papers. This one is one of my personal favorites. There is 7 megabyte HTML file called The Lichens of the Alps, and it is just what it sounds like. It's just a list of lichens that grow in that mountain range, and that took much longer than it needed to parse. And so by putting timeouts around a lot of these input jobs and initial parsing functions before we had good understanding of the shape of the data and the size, allowed us to keep these weird documents from blowing up the pipeline. And combining that with sending log messages to Stackdriver to a BigQuery sync, on Google Cloud, allowed us to get pretty good visibility into this kind of stuff so that we could look it up. Why did this fail? What was the document that brought it down? And so on and so forth. So that was pretty good. So let's see, we're at 15 minutes here. And then we went through a period of, so that was great. And then we reached this period of enlightenment, shall we say, and we essentially figured out better ways to do the same things we were already doing. So I'll go over this relatively quickly. So a big problem in document mining is that we need to link the different parts of the text to each other. So here you can see, I want to create a reference between the description of the experiment in text up at the top here, and then I want to link that to this reference down here so that I can say, okay, I've got a description of an experiment, and here's the picture that goes with it. And this sounds easy. You can look at the different pieces of markup, and if we were only doing, and it should be, but of course, the markup that different publishers use is not consistent between them or even within them. Depending on what year it is, a given publisher might do things a completely different way. And so you wind up, if you start with one publisher and just work your way out, you can create these functions. And then when you make a new deal and get a new publisher, as you're growing, basically you just kind of keep redoing this. And so you wind up with this kind of largest code base to solve a relatively simple problem. And then we introduced some new feature where we wanted to extract all the different sentences. And because we had so many publishers at that point, we did it in a general purpose way so that we could do it from any paper. But then, of course, how do you link the outputs of these systems? And what we realized is we were kind of approaching, thinking in the Beam way, a bunch of, and thinking about how we could get the parallelization to work, in a good way, actually, led us to redesign the way we did this system. And so instead of trying to do everything publisher-wise, we first just broke the papers into the different zones and then sent them off for parsing after partitioning them. And this isolated these failure points, right? So I could either fail recognizing whether something's a paragraph or a figure, or I can fail parsing that specific section out. And that gave us way more visibility into what was going on. And then we wanted to link those two things. We actually just did a join in BigQuery. To just link those two things based on the extracted IDs that we linked. And it was a lot easier to reason about and explain and extend and so on. So that was pretty good. So I'll skip to the question section because I see that I'm at time. I've just kind of restated the pre-post thinking that was very beneficial to us. And I've got some useful tips here, but I'll skip to questions now since we're just about at time.
Who is going to be sharing the questions over the chat. So let's wait a minute to see if our audience. Okay, so the first question is, the merge long string that brought my NLP tokenization algorithm to its knees happened to me too. Timeouts are a good idea. Dataflow is also working on hotkey detection as well as frequency distribution for processing time by element. Also, we have something we call job visualizers in the works. landing at some point in Q4. That means in the months after October.
Cool.
Yes.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Yeah, it's pretty decent so far, but yeah, any extra stuff would be great. And yeah, like unbounded data gives you two problems. One of these is timeouts, and the other is you really need to be making assertions on the shape and the schema of your data. And so that would be my other pro tip: is put timeouts around all your inputs, but also use data classes in your Python code if you're running a Python shop, which is what we are doing. And particularly, there's a library called Pydantic. That we use to do runtime data class validation, and it does introduce a performance cost, but we find the benefit is very worth it. Is that things fail very early as soon as the schema and data contracts are violated, versus when you try to put them into a DB somewhere hours later.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Christian. We didn't have more questions. If anybody has further questions, you can ask them through the users mailing list. And I want to remind everybody watching the streaming of the events that through the event, we're going to be asking questions on the Slack channel for a trivia to get a chance to win some cool prizes. And also, everybody's going to be hanging out at the Slack channel, so you can ask questions to the speakers and other attendees. So thank you so much. And the last point I want to remind everyone is that we have a code of conduct for the event, and you can read it on the events page. Thank you so much. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you.